Today I was talking to Celia Ryker about her latest book, Augusta, a book inspired by her grandmother and the events of her grandmother's life. Incredibly interesting. And there's so much love and affection that Celia has for her family. And just as a little teaser, Augusta was married at 13 when she left school. Find out more. I hope you enjoy this episode. As always, if you do, please like, subscribe, share, tell your friends and family. The podcast is the gift that keeps on giving. Hello, welcome to the David Watson podcast. Thank you for joining me. How are you?
I'm good. How are you?
I'm very well. And
thank you for having me.
Oh, you're very welcome. You're very welcome. And the book that we're going to talk about I think, is going to be absolutely fascinating, especially when you compare it to how we live today. And we'll get into that. But just for reference, could you tell people where you are? I'm based in the UK in Wiltshire.
I'm currently in Vermont. It's been snowing. It has stopped. So we don't have much snow this year, but people can still ski.
That's good. We don't have any snow here, where I am in England. Although a couple of weeks ago I was in Munich, and they had some very heavy snow. And instead of being able to fly home on the Monday morning, I didn't get a flight until Thursday night. We were snowed in.
Whoa.
So probably much more similar to weather that you have than anything that I ever experienced in England. But so yeah, could you just give people an outline of the book you've written, Augusta?
Augusta is based on my grandmother's life story. And she was married off to the widowed father of one of her classmates at the age of 13, and then abandoned by her second husband that was in Arkansas. And then she was abandoned by her second husband in 1920's Detroit with 4 children to provide for. So her life was very complicated. And the grandmother I knew, I never heard any of this until I got older. She lived in a cottage near a lake, and I thought she lived a wonderfully simple life until I got older and found out how complicated her story had been. And the more I knew, the more I wanted to know, so I kept asking people questions.
I can imagine, because the reason before we started recording the podcast, I said I'm very interested because my grandmother was from Southern Ireland. Around the same age as your grandmother would have been, and was one of 18 children, and only 13 survived into adulthood. And there's a thing about, because this happened similar to your grandmother, it's the Depression, that people don't understand what that level of poverty was like.
Yes, my mother did tell me that my grandmother arrived in Detroit wearing a feed sack for a dress. That's how poor she was. So the level of poverty is extreme. And then when I looked into what it was like near the turn of the 20th century for Arkansas farmers, and found out that was really common for them to wear feed and feed sacks for dresses, and they shopped the feed sack for the kind of dress they wanted to make.
And that's crazy, isn't it? When you think of all the brands that come out today and how much people will spend on a dress or a vest or a t-shirt, and these guys were fighting over sacks of feed to make a dress.
And flour. The flour sacks, I guess, were softer, and because the flour company knew women were using them for dresses, they created a little more attractive look.
So that's just mind-boggling, isn't it? When you look at how we live today, and you go back basically 100 years, just over 100 years, and there's a company out there who sell flour basically in large material type sacks of some form of canvas, and they're like, if we can do this a certain way, it's more appealing to poor people, because they need, when it's empty, they'll need to make a dress out of it.
Oh, yeah, it was a surprise to me. Well, it wasn't a big surprise to me because my mother had told me that my grandmother arrived in Detroit wearing a sack like that as a dress. But the other things I discovered when I was doing my research, I thought, wow, there were very few choices in general, and the choices for women were even fewer, and then the choices that the poverty brought were even fewer. I mean, that you grew up and you got married, that was it, because your career choices would be, for a poor person, would be housekeeping and a waitress, which is what she became.
So what you said about choices and the two they had, and she became a waitress. What enabled that?
I don't think it felt so much as being enabled as a necessity. She had to find a way to feed her children. And what can I do? I have no clerical skills. I have no, and so she turned to her friend who had eaten in a restaurant. And in my book, she hadn't. And she may well have not eaten in a restaurant before she became a waitress, because they didn't do that. So, yes, my mother told me about a Polish woman who helped my grandmother when her first husband left. And so I created this person that I'd never heard anymore, except that I knew she was from Poland. And so, and I had her be a little more knowledgeable than Augusta, because she'd been in Detroit longer. But yes, to be moved from, in her case, Poland or from Arkansas, it was almost as extreme a change. There was no language change, except that in Arkansas, they talked quite differently than they did in Detroit. So,
when you were, no, please carry on.
Well, my grandmother did not, I don't recall her ever having a Southern accent, and I'm assuming she deliberately got rid of that. And I did put that into the book, because even when I was young, I heard people refer to people with Southern accents as dumb hillbillies. So I did put her need to change that in the book.
Okay, because it's interesting, as I was reading through the bio, you talked about, whilst trying to write about your grandmother, you then switched to the third person.
Yes. Well, I thought I'd write in the third person omniscient, so I could tell you what she was thinking, what her children were experiencing, and maybe fellow employees. But when I sat down to write, I found myself writing it from her point of view. And oddly enough, there were times when I felt like she was sitting in the corner watching, or that I was being directed by her. I'd sit down to write, I'm going to write this today. And when I finished, I'd look at it and go, I don't even know where that came from. So, there were times when I felt as if I were channeling my grandmother.
I understand that.
And I worry that she may not have approved of what I've done, but I'm hoping.
Yeah. I'm going to play on that a little bit, if I may, because I wrote a book once, and I had the same experience. It felt like somebody was telling me what to write. How did that feel for you?
Oh, it was almost a relief to think, yes, she does approve, and I'm writing this is what she wanted. I write one nightmare scene, and I didn't know where it came from, and I thought maybe that actually happened, but I don't know. And so that's one of the times when I sat down to write something else, and that appeared on the screen when I was finished, and thought, wow, I don't know. But yes, it helped me be a little more relieved that she might not disapprove. I know, double negatives, but I was worried that she might disapprove. And the image on the cover of the book is a picture of her. And I know she didn't I remember her not caring to have her picture taken. I remember her saying to my father, "Oh, you don't want a picture of this old horse face." Every time he took out his camera, she'd make faces. And We have lots of pictures of her making faces. My mother said the only way to get a decent picture of her was to take a picture of her holding the baby, a baby. And I have a really nice picture of her holding my sister when she was very small. And so, but I thought, oh, I don't know if she'd approve of this. When my aunt gave me that picture, it's from a 2.5 by 3.5 inch daguerreotype. And my aunt, I already knew she'd been married off early, but my aunt said this was taken on her wedding day. And she's wearing her 8th grade graduation dress.
Oh, wow.
And I thought, ew. I thought of myself in 8th grade, and I can't even imagine. And not only being married off so young, but being married off to someone old enough to be her father was just disturbing in every way to my young thought processes. I thought, oh, who would do that? And I had a very hard time writing that scene where her parents inform her of their intentions. And I put it off and put it off and put it off. And finally, when I finally sat down to write that scene where her parents inform her of what they think she should do, it just flowed. They didn't have many choices either. And so this man who has a farm, has a job, has a proven history of providing for his family, it would like her to be his wife. What seems like a great choice. What other choices do you have? So I made that part of the story too, that her parents didn't feel like they had many choices either.
Can we just discuss that a little bit? Because I think it's important that people understand that whilst by today's standards, we can be shocked at the idea of a 13-year-old being married, it wasn't uncommon. It was, in fact, if you were going to look at it, I'm sure your research shows you the same. It was common. It was common practice for,
yes,
effectively for a female, once you went through puberty, you're an adult female and you're there to be married off because we can't take care of you and you have a responsibility now to start your own family.
And that's one of the lines I put in there that I read, that another person describing what was said to her, we can't keep feeding you forever. Yeah. So that was part of it, that was her lot in life. And I don't remember her, she didn't complain. I had relatives who complained a lot, but I don't remember. She died when I was quite young, but she made a big impression on me. And I don't recall her being angry about anything or talking about the past like it was bad. But she appears in my first book, which is a memoir about hiking the Long Trail. She appears several times. And when I'm sitting on top of a mountain, looking at these snakes sunning themselves on a rock, I remember that my grandmother, when she realized I was afraid of snakes, caught them and showed me how beautiful they were. And when she found out I was afraid of the loon call on the lake, she took me out on the lake to show me what the loons were. And so she introduced me to the forest and to nature. And so she shows up in that book several times. And she passed away when I was barely 6, but I do have very vivid memories of walking in the woods with her and of her showing me how beautiful snakes were. So
it's interesting.
She did make an impression.
It's interesting because you used the phrase, she seemed to accept that was her lot in life. And
yes.
Whenever I've spoken to, like, my nan I was about 13, 14 when my nan died. And the way that, so I was fortunate in the sense I'd gotten a little bit older. I'd gone back to Ireland with her a few times and stuff. So, I knew her brothers and sisters well and things like that. And you had, by the time you get to sort of like your teen years, you've known them long enough to sort of ask questions. Not the same way that I would today, but they all had this. Well, that's the way the dice were rolled. That is your lot in life.
Yes. Yes, and she accepted that. I thought her life was wonderfully simple. She lived in a cottage that you had to pump the water at the kitchen sink. And I thought that was so exciting. And she did have an indoor toilet, but you had to pump the bucket full at the sink and then pour it to flush, which I thought was just wonderful. And looking back, her life, her that little cottage was so simple because that may have been all she could afford. But it seemed wonderful to me, and she's treated it like this is our home. And she could cook she cooked on a little camp stove, and she could cook a meal. And I don't know if I remember this or I remember being told so many times about this, that she would fix a meal, and on at least one occasion, she pushed herself back from the table and said, I don't know who's doing the dishes, but I cooked this dinner and I'm going fishing. And she did love to fish.
That's brilliant. What happened that you decided to write the book?
Oh, good grief. I thought about this for a very long time. When I began to write this book, I found the notes that I had written 35 years earlier about how did I find them when I can't find my shoes half the time. But I found those notes, and and I looked through the list of people I had to interview, and they had all passed away. And so when I began talking to some of my grandmother's other grandchildren, I received wildly conflicting stories. I mean, wildly conflicting stories. And I thought, I'm just going to write the stories I remember hearing and the way I thought of these stories as they were told to me. So that's how I wrote the book, because when I tried to get right down to the very, very facts of the situation, again, I received wildly conflicting stories. And even in my early notes, my father and his sister could not agree on what their mother's first husband's name had been. Mm-hmm. I mean, that's fairly firsthand, and they couldn't remember his name. I did find out that my aunt was correct, but I find it interesting that trying to remember these things, my brother, sister, and I, we can't agree on the simple memories, like our father did get run over by a truck when he was very young. And I was talking to my siblings, and I said, he was hit by a garbage truck. And my sister said, oh, no, he was hit by a trolley car. And my brother said, no, he was hit by a Wonder Bread truck. And I mean, these are all stories that we think we heard. And so that's why this is a novel and not a biography. I kept to the facts as closely as I could, and the stories that I remember being told. And some of it is how they affected me at that time, what I thought. For instance, in the opening scene, when she's walking past the home of the family who adopted her youngest daughter, my mother told me that story many times. I always imagined it happening in the fall. And I imagined them living on a corner lot because I didn't want to think of my grandmother walking through the alley to see her daughter in someone else's yard. But my mother told me that story many times and said that when she realized that Lottie recognized her as that woman who walked by so often, she determined she could never go back again, and she didn't.
Yes.
So, yeah, these are... Even as a child, I knew that was hard.
But that's, I mean, I'm trying to, I need a second on this, because for while you were telling me this, I'm thinking about how difficult it must be to just give up a child. Okay. Yeah. And we can talk about the reasons that she had to do that. And then I'm trying to take on board, she knows where the child is and has to walk past the child. So we'll see her own daughter growing up. And then,
yes,
then that last bit you mentioned, she realizes the child recognizes her as this woman who walks past. So she then has to make the decision never to let her see her again.
Right.
And it's just like, there's almost three levels of heartbreak.
Exactly. And I was a child when I was told this story the first time, and I compared that to my puppy. And I thought, how would I feel if I had to give my puppy away? And I mean, this is a puppy, and walk past the neighbor's yard and see my puppy over there. And I thought, oh, so as a child, that's how it hit me.
It's a good connection for a child to make
that you love and give it away. Yeah.
Yeah. That's very insightful for a child.
Well, the puppy was sitting right there when I heard the story. But yes, I knew that was huge. And my mother did tell that story fairly often. And Augusta was my father's mother. And my mother is the one who told me most of the stories about her, because my mother adored her mother-in-law. She thought she was fabulous. And my father didn't talk about these things much. When I got older and asked him specific questions, he would say he didn't remember, which he probably didn't, and then my mother would fill in where he had left off. So, but I did get a lot of wonderful stories and some great memories, even though she passed away when I was quite young.
Do you know what happened to the girl?
Pardon me?
Do you know what happened to the girl after she was adopted?
Yes, I can't tell you how, but that is the story does end well.
Okay.
And it does end well. It does end up with the family being united, and I won't tell you how that happened, and there were conflicting stories about how that happened too. So, but yes, I grew up with three grandmothers.
Okay.
One that was much older.
Okay. So, what do you know about your grandmother before she got married?
Pardon me?
What do you know about your grandmother, or what were you able to find out about your grandmother before she got married? So before she was 30.
Before she got married, I only heard that she was on a farm in Arkansas, and I assumed it was a very poor farm since she was wearing a feed sack as a dress. And when I did the research and found out what that would have been like at the turn of the 20th century, I was stunned. And the fact that she finished 8th grade was kind of a big deal, because in many cases, children didn't go that far in school. If they were old enough to work at home, they took them out of school. And the fact that she got an 8th grade education was something for that time. And even in Detroit in the 1920s, it was common for young people's educations to end in the 8th grade. You finished the 8th grade, you got a little diploma, you were a graduate.
I think it's hard for people to comprehend, and when I'm trying to help sort of build the picture towards people don't think a lot of people don't understand, because it's called the Great Depression. The problem with that is the word "great" in front of it is misunderstood.
Yes.
And when they say depression, they think, "Oh, I felt depressed yesterday," and
Yes.
the context is lost on people in today's world of what the Great Depression actually was, and people have tried to compare it to recessions in the modern world, but the reason, one, financially it doesn't apply. Two, it was largely affected America, or wealthy people in other countries that invested in America. But it's not like it's spread around the world. And the other thing being that people often don't understand is when the Depression hit America in the 20s, there was no support. Nobody was coming to rescue you. So if you couldn't figure it out, you died hungry in a ditch somewhere.
Yeah. And I'm assuming that I don't know what made them move to Detroit, but I did some research into what brought most of the people north to Detroit, and it was work. They had to find a job. They had to pay to feed their families, and I did some research into what tenement life was like, and oh my goodness, That was no easy.
Give us a description.
Pardon?
Give us a description of tenement life.
Well, most of them, the research I did, most of them were 2 rooms. And I kept seeing, when I was looking at pictures of them, there were 2 rooms, and between the 2 rooms was a door, and next to that door was a window. And I kept trying to figure out why that was. And there had been a law passed that said that these tenement apartments had to have windows. So instead of putting an outside window, they put the window between the 2 rooms. And so that's why I saw so many. There's a window and a door between 2 rooms within the apartment. And then I found out they passed another law that said you have to have at least 1 window opening to the exterior of the building. And they called them tuberculosis windows because that was supposed to keep you from getting tuberculosis. And so, yeah, it was a rough life. And I saw that they had wood stoves and I couldn't figure out why I kept seeing tubs sitting on top of steps. It was sitting on an elevator. And I thought, how do you even get in a tub when it's that high? Because they hand washed everything, and that was the only tub they had, they raised it so the women could use them to wash clothes.
Yeah.
And I thought, oh, wow. So I was seeing these images as I was going through all this research and thinking, why would they do that? And it took me a while to find the answers to why there were extra windows and why they had the tubs up on elevated steps. But yeah, they had to make do with what they had.
It's interesting, isn't it? Because the way you just described the building. So originally they had no windows, external windows at all. And a law was passed, so they had an internal window, which is of absolutely no use to anybody. And then eventually, because of tuberculosis, which people take for granted now, you just go to hospital and get some antibiotics. You have to have at least 1 external window. And the thing that resonates with me a lot is anybody that lived like that, who had a roof over their head, food on the table, and had been paid that week, would consider their life blessed.
Yeah. And I found out that a waitress at that time made $8 or $9 a week. And then I had to figure out how much eggs cost and sugar cost and flour cost. And I thought, that's not a lot of money, even when the prices were so very low. If you made $8 a week and a dozen eggs cost 30 cents, that's a big part of your.
It is.
Eggs were expensive.
Yeah. Because everyone's, it was much cheaper back then. Yeah, but not compared to wages, it wasn't. Like you say, 30 cents and you're only earning $8, $9. And that doesn't go far.
No.
How much was rent every week?
I didn't get much on what rent was. And so I didn't even address it. And that is, I kept looking and trying to find out, but I couldn't. I know it costs $0.25 to ride the bus if you went from one side of the city to the other. So again, these are big expenses when you make $8 a week.
They are. And do you know at all how many hours she had to work for that $8?
I don't know. I didn't find any information about that. I didn't look as closely at that. I don't know how many hours she had to work for that.
I bet. I tell you what. I bet it wasn't a 35-hour week.
Yeah, I would bet not.
Do you have any idea about where she worked?
Where she lived within the city?
Yeah, where she lived and where she worked. Do you know the restaurants or anything like that?
I don't know. I never got any specific information about that. And by the time I was writing the book, anyone who may have had that information had passed away. I do know that she worked in a restaurant that was near a police precinct, and she had a lot of police officers come in and out of the restaurant. And I found those characters fun to write, that I could write about these two police officers that come in a lot, and them being there when her son is injured and helping her, helping get him to the hospital. And I did have a lot of stories like that. No specifics, so I had to make up names, and but I found those characters fun to write.
I can imagine. How did you start building up these characters?
I don't know. I just assumed that there'd be an Irish cop and an Italian cop, and I had them call one another the names they would have called one another at the time, and Mick and Wop, and the terms that were commonly used at the time, and so I enjoyed that too, that I could do a little research into what the Italian part of town was like, and what Bricktown was like, and that sort of thing. So, but I had to. That's where I went completely fictional, when I could do the exchanges between the officers in the restaurant, and the fact that they were helping her out and thought her husband was a no good, and she was better off without him, and that sort of thing. But that doesn't help when you've got to pay bills. So
No, it doesn't. So what was if we look at it from you were writing the book from your grandmother's point of view, but you also kind of felt a channeling, as if she was telling you the story to write.
correct.
What were the emotions that you were feeling?
Oh, good grief. When I went into how little money she had to feed her family, I wondered how she would have felt if, there was talk of taking her children away from the home and putting them in care. And I did create those characters also. And she was being watched a lot, so that they'd make sure that, and that is one of the reasons for adopting out the youngest daughter, because in my story, they didn't even know she had 4. They thought she only had 3. So she has to find a way to make it possible for her to feed her 3 children. And the adoptive family, I never heard what the financial arrangement was, but I was told many times that there was a financial arrangement of some sort. And I never heard what it was. And again, when I talked to her other grandchildren, there were wildly conflicting stories. And one was that they were paying for a house, that they were paying the mortgage on a home, which would have given her then a piece of property, which would have made it possible for her to leave the city and go to that cottage. And but I don't know.
It's hard to imagine having to make those difficult decisions to survive, because we, by and large, thanks to social media, Disney, and Hollywood, we like to think of the world as being romantic, whereas nature doesn't care what your feelings are about something. And there's a point where you have to, regardless of how your heart may be getting ripped out, and how you make that peace with your soul, he had to make a black and white decision of, this is how we survive moving forward.
Right. And she not only survived, in a sense, she thrived. She raised 3 children that went on and married and had children, and sometimes I wonder how my father learned how to be such a good father, since he never saw that in his life. But I don't know how she made it. She made my father feel like this little toy that you have, and it's the only toy that you have, is a perfectly wonderful toy, and you should be glad to have this perfectly wonderful toy, even though that's it, that's your toy. Yeah, I have that toy. He gave that to me. He said, this for many years was the only toy I had. And it's a little metal lion bank. And he said, I used to march it around and play with it. And he said, this was my toy. So,
there's a lesson in that, isn't
and
there?
again, never thinking that I didn't have toys the way the other children did, but that was, he had that special toy, and he kept it until, late in his life, he gave it to me.
Was there any, as you're talking about this, I mean, you can't see what I can see. So that there's a way your face lit up as you were talking about your father. When you were discovering more about your grandmother and effectively how your father was raised, did that give you a different reflection on it?
Different reflection. I don't know that it was different. It just added a little more dimension to it, but it was all part of the same story. And I don't know that it made a big difference. It just added to the story that I already had in my mind. And I know my father looked for his father when he was a young adult and never found any evidence of him beyond Detroit. And when my brothers were young adults, they decided they'd find him. We've got computers, we can do this. And they could find no evidence of him beyond Detroit. And my oldest brother said one day, that son of a gun may have just ended up in the Detroit River, because he wasn't a very nice man.
Yeah.
And back then, it could have happened, and they never would have identified a body that they found downriver somewhere. But
no reason to.
But they couldn't find any evidence of him beyond Detroit when he just walked away.
Okay. It's interesting, isn't it? I always find it fascinating that the way you talk about your father and then the way you're talking about your grandmother is all of the hardship that they had, their capacity to love is just tenfold. It's incredible.
Yeah. My grandmother taught me not to be afraid of snakes. And I do remember one time when I did something I wasn't supposed to do. I went across that street that I'm not allowed to cross and came back with a snake. and it was a copperhead. And when I lied and told her that I caught it by the lake, I got in big trouble, and I was sent to her room to wait for punishment. And I remember sitting in there, and over here is a glowing crucifix, and over here is a glowing Donald Duck for her grandchildren. Yeah. So there was a framed picture of Donald Duck that glowed in the dark, and this other, and I'm sitting there going, I don't know which is worse. But, and I remember that, but I don't remember what the punishment was. I remember waiting for the punishment, but I don't remember the punishment at all. But I do remember waiting. I thought, I'm sure that was an effective.
Well, you still remember it. So.
I remember waiting, yes.
So what happened? What happened? So she moved to Detroit, got a job as a waitress. What happens next?
She was a waitress until, I'm not sure why she retired, but she was no longer working in her 60s, which would have been uncommon then. I assumed there was probably something wrong that I didn't know about that kept her from working.
Okay.
But I don't know what that was, and I never heard what it was.
So how has any of this shaped your life, if it has at all?
How has it affected my life?
Yeah, or shaped it? What are the lessons that,
I do. She made me appreciate nature. I love walking in the woods, which is what Walking Home was about. And she, I think knowing how difficult her life had been makes me more aware of other people who are struggling. and that we may not know her even struggling, because I didn't know she had been through all of that. I had no indications of that. And my father was a happy guy. I mean, and I know that when my parents got married, he used to pose as a Boy Scout. I mean, they didn't have any money. The Depression was still going on. And he would go to homes and claim to be a Boy Scout and tell them the Boy Scouts are having a fundraiser. Can we pick some of your flowers from your gardens to sell them? And the women would go and pick flowers for him because they didn't want him messing around in their gardens. And then he'd pretend to be a Boy Scout on the corner and sell the flowers so that he could feed his family. He had a young son, and he was suffering from dementia in his older years. And I went to see him one time, and he was working with a therapist there, a doctor there. And he was talking to my father, and he said, "So how many children do you have, Bud?" And he said, "I have 2 boys." And I looked at the doctor, and he looked at my dad, and he said, "What year is it?" And he said, 1943. And I looked at the doctor, and I said, "Yes, he does have 2 boys in 1943. I said, "Are you planning to have more children?" And he said, "Are you kidding? I can barely feed the 2 I've got." I said, "Surprise, you're going to have 3 more."
So,
But
so you won a 5?
yeah. And he made sure that we had everything we ever needed. And we were not poor, but we were middle class, maybe lower middle class, but we never felt that way.
Yeah.
He would find a way to get things for us.
Yeah.
That if because we had horses when we were young, and that's an expensive thing. And he worked out a way to get this horse that wasn't very expensive and keep it at this place in exchange for other things that he did for this man, so that my sister and I could go and ride this horse, and that we couldn't afford. But he found a way to make it work by trading things with other people.
Well, there was probably resilience that he learned growing up.
Yes.
Because I'd imagine, as you say that, it occurred to me, and I could be very wrong, that one of the ways that you would have had to survive when there just isn't any money, there isn't any work, is you need to be useful enough to people that people are looking out for you.
Yeah, and to learn how to barter and negotiate, and you need that and I need this, and we could. I do know that there was a time when my grandparents would run a line from the electric pole to the house.
Yeah.
And at night, and then unhook it in the daytime so nobody knew they were stealing electricity. That was during the Depression. Yes.
Yeah. But there would have been, you'd have to be clever, and you'd have to be resourceful like that, but when bartering, you'd have to be able to see the value of what somebody, there's that sales pitch that, if you're going to sell something to somebody, you have to understand why it's valuable to them. Because if they're not in the market for it, the best sales pitch in the world isn't going to work. So being able to see what somebody needed and your value to provide that takes, there's there's almost an instinct that has to be honed and sharpened to be able to pivot in any moment.
I think that's part of what made my father a good salesman, and that is what he was. He was a car salesman. And I remember one time going to pick him up. My car was out, and I was using his to pick him up at work. It's 9:00 at night. It's time to close up. And there's a couple there, and they're just talking and talking and talking about their son. And he's listening and asking them, and and we go on and on. And when we finally got in the car, and I said, they didn't buy anything. He said, they'll be back. And the next night I went to pick him up, and those two people were there again talking about their son, but they were signing the paperwork. And we got in the car, and I said, so they came back and bought a car? And he said, yes. And they bought they bought a used car for their son as well. And so that's how my father was a salesman. He really liked people, and he'd listen to their stories, and he probably learned that, like you said, out of necessity. He had to figure out what people wanted, or how to sell some. So he was fairly good at that. And I think part of it was liking people.
Yeah. I think it helps.
Yeah.
Because it's very difficult to listen to people if you don't actually like people to start with.
Yeah. And I think that's part of what allowed my grandmother to survive as well as she did, was getting along with people. And I did write in some of the friends she made and some of the people she worked with that I didn't hear any real stories with names attached, but I did know that she had people she worked with that she was close to. And so I was able to fictionalize them a bit. So that I think that caring about other people was maybe part of what he learned from her.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah. Going off in a different direction altogether, am I correct? This is your second book?
Yes.
For people listening who are just interested in the process of writing a book, where did it start for you? Because you mentioned the notes that you had from 35 years ago.
Yeah. It began with me writing that first scene that I've already told you about. It's the opening scene in the book. I thought it was going to end up later in the book, about her walking by the home of the family that adopted her daughter. And the publisher decided that should be the prologue. That should get the reader there. And so it's an easy story for me to tell you, because the reader's going to get that in the first chapter. But what started the writing, the notes from way back, I had no idea how to write a book. I did get myself in with a good writers group, which was helpful. And throughout, even though I was giving riding lessons and training horses, that's what I did for a living. I took classes at local universities and writing seminars and stuff, because I thought someday I'm going to write a book. And it wasn't until my 59th birthday that I thought, you better do some of these things that you say you're going to do. And one of them was hiking the Long Trail, which I did. And then I wrote a book about that. And the book that was waiting was Augusta. And I went back and found those notes, and taking the classes and attending the seminars and learning how the writing process works. And getting in with a writing group that is very helpful, because what we do is we meet once a week, and I'll put a scene out there and they'll read it and say, this doesn't make any sense, or I really like this part, and then I'll do the same for them. And I learn almost as much about the process from what they're doing, even though that's science fiction and this is a memoir and this is a novel. The writing process is very similar. And so, getting with the right people. And one of the things, I belong to the League of Vermont Writers, and they are constantly reading books about craft. They're constantly working on their craft, not just writing, but finding out what works for other writers. And so that's been very helpful.
What is
and being around other people that write, it helps.
Just to clarify, what is the Long Trail?
Pardon me?
What is the Long Trail?
You broke up. The Long Trail is the original long distance hiking trail in the United States. It goes from the Massachusetts border of Vermont along the Green Mountains to Canada. So you're walking across the length of the state of Vermont in the mountains. It's about 500 miles. Yeah, about 500 miles.
How long does that
Or
take you?
4. It took me, it takes, if you stay on the trail, it should take about a month. It took me 7 years because we hiked in sections. I was hiking with a friend and we go out and we do as much as we could do in this period of time. And then we come back and do that. And then when she couldn't do it, I tried some by myself. And there are some disasters in the book about that. But largely the book is about what I think about when I slow down to the speed of my legs for days on end, because you don't have the distractions of other people or radio, television, traffic was amazing. When the first time I drove a car after I'd been on the trail for just 7 days, I was stunned by how fast everyone was going. And I have been called an aggressive driver, but when I found cars piling up behind me, I didn't speed up. I pulled over because I had slowed down that much in 7 days of just not being in that faster mode.
Slowed down to the speed of my legs. That's a book.
Yeah, that's it.
But
Life at the speed of your legs.
Yeah, that should be a title of a book itself.
Yeah.
That's a really nice phrase, that is. Slowed down to the speed of my legs.
Thank you. I use that all the time because that's what it felt like. That's how this top speed you're going all day long. And I didn't hike as fast as some people. So I was even slower than most. But yeah, you think differently. You remember things. I remembered this thing about my grandmother. And oddly enough, when there were some ladders we had to go down in the northern part of the state where it was getting more and more rough. And I thought of a cousin I hadn't seen in years, and a time that we were in a barn way back by the railroad track where we weren't supposed to be. And we had gone up into a hayloft to see what we could find. And there was nothing there but moldy hay. But each time I came down a ladder, I thought of her at the bottom of that ladder in that barn 60 years ago. So, yeah, and it's that sort of thing where you think about people and things that are important and at a different level.
There's something wonderful about when you start hiking, when you're going from point to point, because the only thing you can do is keep putting one foot in front of the other till you get there. And if it takes 6 hours, it takes 6 hours. If it takes 10 hours, it takes 10 hours. And you have to sort of, you have to almost reside to the fact of there's no way to speed this up.
No. Well, one of the things I discovered early on is we're hiking in the mountains, and I'd look up and I'd think, oh, if we go that way, it won't take as long as if we end up going that way. And I learned to just look at the highest, darkest point and think, that's where we're going. We're never going around the summit. We're always going to the summit. And it made it a little easier because I kept thinking, oh, we didn't go that way. We're going this way. But yeah, getting to the summit as after the hike, my husband was talking to the Sandy, the woman who hiked with me, and he said, what was the hardest part? And we said, oh, getting to the summit. It's just the rock. And he said, what was the best part? And we said, being at the summit. And some of it may have been that it was so hard to get there that you had to appreciate it. But the first time I was on a mountaintop where I had a 360, I almost fell down. I felt as if I were falling off of the mountain. And it was a big area. There was no fear of falling, but I ended up on the ground clinging to the rock like, I think, and it took me a while to just get settled down because I'd never been that far up in that open. Yeah. And look around and go, whoa, I can't even stand up here. But yes, the summits were amazing.
Okay. Just if you could somehow magically see your grandmother today, where would you take her?
Where would I take her?
Yeah, what would you show her?
What would I show her?
This girl who was married at 13, where would you like to take her?
It just popped into my head, and my parents are both gone. I would show her the house where her son raised his kids.
That's nice.
Because it was just a lovely colonial home in a 2-story home in a nice neighborhood in a really nice little town. And I think that would have, why did I think of that? But yeah, it would be to show her where Buddy raised his kids.
That's nice. That's nice. And I've got one last question, which again is very off the cuff, but along the same lines. If you could go any place in history, any place in time, be anywhere, where would you go? When? And what vehicle would you drive, and what music would you be listening to?
I could go anywhere in time. Where would I go? I'm not even certain of that. That's going to haunt me. That question is going to haunt me. I would like to see my parents again. And I think I would like to go back to that house in the first car I ever owned. And what music would I be listening to? Probably Peter, Paul, and Mary. I'd like that. But yeah, I think I would. The first car I bought was my car, and I bought it myself with my money I made at my work, at my job, and finding out that I could actually make a living training horses and teaching horseback riding. Wow!
What was the car?
It was a Chevy Malibu. Malibu Super Sport, had a little SS on the side, which made it far more valuable to me. But very nice car. It was a Malibu Super Sport, and it was blue.
That's lovely.
And it was mine.
Yeah. And that's, like you say, that's the important part, because that's mine. I've paid for it, and I did this off my own back.
Yeah.
Did you buy it off your dad?
No, he was not selling cars at the time. And I was shocked when I went and talked to the salesman, and he didn't seem to care about me that much. And I thought, that's not the way my dad would have done it. But I did find over the years that we did seek out salesmen that did. My husband and I, we'd follow a salesman, and my father had people follow him when he went from selling Fords to Pontiacs, because this guy cared. And like, we went in one time, we both drove trucks because he's a veterinarian and I train horses. And we decided that we should have a car to get into if we're going somewhere nice. We've come a long way here. We can get a car. And we went there and we looked at what we could afford and decided we didn't want what we could afford. But he listened to us, and he found a Thunderbird. And I do appreciate nice cars because my father and brothers were both into cars. And he found a Thunderbird in our price range. And I said, oh, yeah, it's in Ohio. And he said, I said, don't bring that up. We don't know if we want it. And he said, it's already here. Come in and look at it. Now, there's a salesman who listened to us, listened to what we wanted to spend, listened to what we liked, and found it for us. And we loved that car.
That's
so, yeah.
And that's the important thing, isn't it? It comes back to that listening again.
Listening, yes.
Being interested in people and listening. And I thoroughly enjoyed listening to you. And I just wanted to say, it's really nice to listen to somebody who loves their family so much.
They're hard not to love.
Yeah,
there were times when they made it hard. Even harder, but we do actually kind of like one another most of the time.
It comes across as a great deal of affection, and it's been a genuine pleasure to listen to you. Thank you.
Well, thank you.